Can-do is more than just an attitude. Can-do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can-do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can-do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 5th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen 1 million refugees fleeing Ukraine under Russian bombardment, the ruble hitting a record low against the dollar in the wake of international sanctions, and the opening of the Winter Paralympic Games in Beijing without Russian or Belarusian athletes. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Kate Samuelson and the boss man, Holden Frith, and from daily history podcast The Retrospectors, which I would highly recommend, it's Arion McNicoll. Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
What does it mean when birds start falling from the sky?
So this is a flock of yellow-headed blackbirds crashing to the ground by the hundreds on a random street in Mexico last week in Chihuahua. So you can see several of them just literally, dozens of the birds are left dead. Many of them come right back up, are able to fly away, but it's believed they may have died as a result of toxic fumes from a nearby heater or even something having to do with power lines nearby. It's still, frankly, a big old mystery.
Troy Hayden reporting for Fox 10 a couple of weeks ago. Holden, what did I just watch?
Yes, what you watched is a really quite genuinely dramatic piece of footage with a huge cloud of yellow-headed blackbirds, which look a bit like those enormous clouds of starlings you see where they're all sort of swooping and swirling around the sky.
Yeah, dense mass of blackbirds, basically.
Yeah, and in this case, you see them all suddenly take a really abrupt turn towards the ground. And as the commentary on the clip said, quite a lot of them then don't fly up back into the sky again. They just stay dead on the tarmac.
Okay, but that was a few weeks ago. What's been happening since then to make this your story of the week?
Yeah, what happened this week is that we did finally get a convincing explanation of what really happened. In the meantime, because it does have such an apocalyptic look to it, it's not all that surprising that this is something that went viral and ended up being picked up by a lot of different news networks, most of which reported on it in this same sort of breathless and slightly bewildered way we've just heard. And so that led to a great many theories, some conspiracy theories seeking to explain the phenomenon. And what I thought was interesting about this was just how varied a lot of these ideas were and what a wide range of people were coming up with them. There were the usual suspects like 5G interference or collision with an invisible alien spaceship, which can probably set to one side. But then there was a lot of other ideas which did at first glance sound vaguely credible. So a lot of commentary suggests this might have been caused by climate change. Most of the people sharing it on social media seem to be inspired by the assumption that if it wasn't climate change, then maybe pollution or some other human action was responsible. And maybe even this, the idea we heard in the clip that it was some sort of toxic gas. Wood-burning heaters were put forward by one worker at a local zoo, possibly mixed with agricultural chemicals and unusual weather.
Okay, but we do have an explanation. I'll return to you for what that explanation is in a minute, and also your broader hypothesis about the human condition. But Kate, in terms of the rarity of footage like this, because everyone was reacting like this because they'd never seen it before, how rare an event is it actually for birds just to fall from the sky?
Yeah, the scene is definitely really eerie, and you can understand why people initially thought that something very sinister was at play to cause just so many of those birds to plummet to their death in such a shocking way. But it's not actually that abnormal or unnatural. So the species, the yellow-headed blackbirds, they fly with this kind of herd mentality. One expert at Cornell in the United States told the Washington Post that they have the same goals, so they agree to move in the same direction. So they're sort of like a school of fish, or an angry mob, if you like. So when they're being attacked by a predator, they inch closer together to create this really tight-knit pack as a survival technique. And they place their wings to each other's tips. But the survival mode is not always foolproof, and sometimes they can misjudge their speed or the distance that they are between the sky and the ground. And so it's not a common thing to happen. It's still a rare event, but it's not completely unheard of. And in fact, the same conclusion was reached a couple of years ago when more than 200 starlings were found dead on a road in Anglesey. So it does happen.
It's also not something, Arion, that we'd be talking about at all if it weren't for the internet, it strikes me. I mean, if it happens but it's not super rare, it's only because it was captured on camera that it's able to be speculated about. But maybe this kind of thing used to happen all the time. It's just people didn't, have images of it.
I think that's right. And I think it is because the footage is so spectacular, horrible as well, because some of those birds didn't make it. But I think that the strength of the footage, in conjunction, as you say, with the fact that it can travel so swiftly around the world and then generate all of these theories that Holden was starting to enumerate, I think that is the thing that made it so compelling, and almost actually the solution, or the final explanation that this was caused by a predatory bird that tried to swoop on them and they fell to the ground, is a little bit underwhelming versus a lot of the stuff that has been suggested, the more fanciful sort of aliens or 5G type explanations. So it sort of comes as a bit of an anticlimax after all of these, 2 weeks of feverish speculation.
Kate, were you drawn in by any of the theories? Because the toxin thing kind of made sense to me, because I've seen, it's a terrible thing to admit to, but it's true. We had some tadpoles that we were supposed to be looking after that were outside in the sun, and they all died instantly, like within a few minutes of each other, when the sun just got a bit hot and it boiled them in their tank. And I thought, well, environmental conditions can cause mass casualties like that amongst tadpoles aren't flocking animals, obviously, but there's a similarity there, isn't there? They're together as a herd. Did you think it could be something like that?
I mean, I have to admit that I actually somehow missed this story, and it seems, it's a huge...
What?
Yeah, I mean, for
Nothing
someone...
else going on in the news. What are you talking
exactly.
about?
Quiet Newsweek. No, for someone who spends as much time on the internet as I do, and on Twitter, and recently on TikTok, to my shame, I don't really understand how I managed to miss it, because it was huge, and as Holden said, it went completely viral. I think in some ways though it's good, because when I learnt about the story, I also learnt about the explanation, so my mind didn't really have an opportunity to kind of hypothesize. So I'm not sure. I think I probably would have assumed it was to do with weather events, as Arion mentioned, but I'd never really thought about it.
Okay, so on to your theory about the human condition then, Holden. So the question is whether that gap between an event happening and it being reported by journalists with a conclusion baked in that Kate experienced, and people experiencing it in real time and seeing it happening and then coming to their own conclusions, that gap didn't used to exist because people didn't have access to the raw footage, but now they do. Is it a good or a bad thing? I mean, I know there's fake news out there, but equally having the sources at hand, being able to make up your own mind, seeing lots of different perspectives on an issue, that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
Like a lot of things to do with the internet and much broader access to information, it is definitely a double-edged sword. And as you correctly diagnosed, I did have an ulterior motive for bringing this clip to our attention, and it was intending to use it to make a broader point. And I think one of the reasons it appealed is that it did feel like a microcosm for how we go about trying to understand the world and how we often go wrong. In that, anyone who's paying attention to the news is constantly faced with some sort of eye-catching or alarming event, and in a lot of cases we never actually get to the point that we now are with the birds, where we do have this convincing and generally accepted answer. We just have to keep living in that zone of uncertainty where we know that something spectacular or challenging has happened. We can't know for sure whether this year's early spring is due to climate change or to random variation in weather. We can't be certain why Putin invaded Ukraine or what he might do next. So without necessarily realizing it, we're all looking at these events with our preconceptions, with our background experience, and then trying to fit those new events into the story that makes most sense to us. So if we're a zoologist in Mexico, and we often see birds dying because of climate change or related stories or because of pollution. Then we see this new event and fit it into that pattern that feels most familiar and comfortable. And we never have that corrective at the end that says, oh, actually, no, this is why all of this is happening. This is the right story. This is what we should believe.
The thing that it put me in mind of was this viral video that went around that was ostensibly of Ukrainians bombarding a Russian tank, or a couple of tanks actually, with Molotov cocktails and driving them back. And it went completely viral and was shared far and wide. But it turns out that the video wasn't from this year or this war at all, but the footage was actually showing Ukrainian demonstrators clashing with police during protests back in 2014. But it was shared by people in part, I think, because people want to believe that a ragtag bunch of insurgents could repel a highly trained and expensively equipped group of Russian soldiers. And this apparently is known as motivated reasoning. And according to Peter Ditto, a social psychologist at the University of California, people are capable of being thoughtful, he said, or rational, but our wishes, hopes, fears, and motivations often tip the scales and make us believe something that we want to believe. And I think that sort of applies both to that Ukrainian example, but also, I suppose, to the various explanations that were being offered for this bird video. People who think that 5G is sinister wanted to see 5G as the cause, and people who think that there are, alien spaceships around us wanted to see this as evidence of that. And I think that sort of is an interesting indication of where we've got to, with that information gap being plugged by what we want to believe rather than the truth or hard evidence.
And often more dramatic than what's really happening as well. As you were suggesting, Kate, the actual explanation is a bit pedestrian. Obviously, not with regard to what's going on in Ukraine, which is pretty catastrophic, but with something like this, there's a desire, isn't there, for people to catastrophize, to see it and say this is emblematic of something much bigger and much more serious when it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, it feels strange to say this, but I think for some people, believing, for example, that COVID is a hoax cooked up by a world government to restrict civil liberties is actually more comforting than to think of it as what it actually is, which is a virus and a complex, unpredictable event that the world was just really unprepared for. I think people turn to these kind of theories and end up spreading misinformation often because it can actually help restore a sense of agency and control for people. And in a pandemic where there's been so much widespread uncertainty and fear, it's kind of understandable that these conspiracy theories have been spreading so widely and that people have latched onto these kind of out there explanations for what the virus is rather than accepting it for what it actually is.
I guess, as you were saying, Holden, the people that are spreading those theories don't think of themselves as conspiracy theorists. As you were saying, they're doing it from their own experience. They think, well, I know what this is, I'll contribute. And I suppose that sort of ability to hear all those different voices can be really useful.
Yes, and the zoologist who is talking about the toxic cloud is not a conspiracy theorist in the conventional sense of the world. He's a theorist in the way that we're all theorists, because we all have to try to sift our way through unfamiliar information. And I'm not sort of bringing this as an example of bad human behaviour necessarily. It's human behaviour, and it's good that we recognise it in ourselves as well as putting it onto other people and sort of, saying, oh, well, people are bringing their prejudices, their preconceptions. Well, that's just the way we all have to deal with the world, because we have our own viewpoints, we have our experiences, and then it takes quite a lot of work to adjust that. And I think, Kate mentioning COVID is a really good example of that. In those first few months of COVID, when we're being bombarded with information, some of it from very credible sources, which then a couple of weeks later would turn out to be very wrong. And the shift from thinking about surfaces and hand washing and cleaning towards airborne transmission and masks, and that took quite a long time to filter its way through the scientific community and to get out into the public, because those scientists were also bringing their own preconceptions, their own theories about what they expected a disease to behave.
Yeah, and I think we're also humans, we're pattern seeking creatures. And I remember reading an article years ago that was discussing why people tend to call or message you when you're thinking of them. And a lot of people believe that they've made some kind of mental connection, or they've got ESP and they've seen this call or text coming in, when in actual fact, our brains are just jumping around all over the place and people are constantly in our thoughts. But we're looking for connections or patterns, and we find one. The problem being that often we find a connection that is false. And I think this could be an example of that before we settled on this final and quite satisfying explanation.
Okay, so in conclusion, wait for trained journalists to digest the week's news into a weekly print publication delivered to your door, using a variety of sources and accurate reporting. Kate, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is extraordinary support in extraordinary times. It's the knowledge and expertise to harness opportunities. Can do is empowering you to get your plans back on track. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Kate, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we seeing a podcast talent rush?
One of the reasons I wanted to come in and talk to you was because I want to just talk freely.
How does that all feel for you personally? That thought that 1 week earlier we could have saved 21,000 lives.
There were some mistakes that we made in terms of the measures, how they were brought in. Well, now you see, Stephen, you're getting into gotcha questions.
No, I genuinely...
Just all total rubbish.
No, I've not even asked the question yet. There needs to be boundaries.
No, those rules were not in place.
Can I ask the question?
You can ask a question.
I'm going to ask the question.
This bit is really hard for me.
People say you were a contradiction.
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock talking to Stephen Bartlett on the Diary of a CEO podcast this week. So, Kate, this was his first big interview, wasn't it? The exclusive that many newspapers and news channels would have been scrambling to get. But he gave it to a podcast.
Yeah, that's right. So Matt Hancock said that he chose to tell his story to Stephen Bartlett, who's a 29-year-old multimillionaire entrepreneur, and he hosts this Diary of a CEO podcast because he has this ability to get people to be really honest about themselves. And Matt Hancock also said that he himself was completely hooked on the podcast and described it as one of the most self-aware podcasts that he's listened to. I mean, people were quite cynical about his decision to give this big scoop to Stephen Bartlett and accused him of trying to cultivate quite a down with the kids image as part of a rebrand attempt. I really liked a tweet by the Novara media journalist Ash Sarkar, who wrote, "I'm not like a regular disgraced ex-minister. I'm a cool disgraced ex-minister," referencing the Mean Girls quote.
Because there's a suggestion, isn't there, that a podcast interview would be chummier than if he submitted himself to Andrew Neil on telly.
I suppose that's part of it, but there is quite a big trend, and that's why this was my story of the week, of big names both behind and in front of the microphone turning to audio as their preferred medium. So obviously we've heard about Matt Hancock choosing to give this big tell-all interview on the Diary of a CEO podcast, but also just the other week, it was announced that Emily Maitlis and John Sopel are leaving the BBC to launch what Maitlis described as a major new podcast and also co-host a radio show on LBC, which is owned by Global, the company which also owns DAX, which is the platform that this podcast is hosted on. Andrew Marr is also leaving the BBC to host a radio show on LBC. So it kind of got me thinking about why exactly we're seeing audio as being the place for these big scoops and big names and what this really means for the future of TV news.
What do you think it means, Arion? You're a podcaster. Do you understand why they've made the move?
I mean, one of the things that this made me think is that it's a story where you really can follow the money. And I looked at IAB's digital ad spend study from last year, which showed that there's just this really big growth in ad spend on digital audio in general that includes podcasting, but also more traditional radio. And that has only been growing in the last couple of years. So, for example, total digital audio spend accounts for £104 million in 2020 compared to £89 million in 2019. So I think partly there's just a lot of money going into podcasting in particular, but also radio in general. And so that kind of at least accounts for Emily Maitlis and John Sopel going off and starting this podcast, which really was shocking to BBC bosses in particular. But it's not just about money. It is also about reach and influence, and podcasting is a growing medium, as we all know. So I think that accounts for some of it, but also maybe people are switching away from the sort of traditional free-to-air TV brands in favour of more streaming services, and we're seeing this real diffusion of the way that people consume media generally.
But also it's kind of cooler, isn't it? Maybe I would say that as a podcaster myself, Holden, but I feel like we've seen this making this show for the last 5 years internally at the companies that fund the week, that it started off being seen, this show, as the sort of nerdy side hustle of a few people who worked in the digital department, and is now a product that people across the organisation would like to appear on and are proud of. And that's partly because it attracts a different audience, doesn't it? Often, in the case of Maitlis and Sopel's podcast, a younger audience than would watch them on the news at 10.
Yeah, it's a different audience. It's a different tone, I think. It will give them a way of probably feeling that they're speaking to people more directly. And I think you saw this a little bit with the BBC's Brexitcast podcast, where some of their regular political correspondents, Europe correspondents, were able to get out of the formula of the 90-second, 3-minute piece to camera and actually have a more conversational approach to digesting politics and news. And I think it allows for a slightly more free-roaming approach. And I think, maybe Matt Hancock, if he did believe that he was going to get a softer interview because he was in a podcast format rather than on TV or radio, what he might not have accounted for is the fact that there's no time limit. So you can't just ride out the clock in that sort of a setting. You are kind of subjecting yourself to a very long form in some cases, and possibly with some podcasts a too long examination. But it's a very different format. It's a different way of connecting with people. And I think for people who've come out of what might feel like a bit of a straitjacket on the BBC, it probably does feel like a step towards freedom.
Do you think that authenticity, Kate, is part of the appeal?
Yeah, I definitely think it is. And I imagine that that's something that attracts a lot of younger listeners. As you said, people might be turning to podcasts because they're trying to reach a broader audience, and definitely podcasts are most popular among the kind of mid-20s to mid-30s age group. And I definitely agree that there is an authenticity with that medium, not necessarily just podcasts, but the radio in general. There's something really special about audio, especially if you're listening with headphones in. You really feel like the speaker is kind of in your head, and I'm finding it quite meta talking about this on a podcast right now. But yeah, I find it comforting, and I feel like it's just that, as I said, there's something really special about it.
But, Arion, a big company like Global, who apparently, reportedly, have offered Maitlis and Sopel and Andrew Marr, who's just gone over to LBC as well, more money than they had at the BBC, which was a lot of money for the kind of prestigious jobs that they had, are only going to be getting into this if they have a business strategy that perhaps does go beyond podcasting. I mean, I do wonder really whether the podcast is the trendy thing to put on the press release, but actually they're going to be doing a show on LBC, which is the speech radio station, which presumably is going to be filmed. And then you've got basically TV newscasters doing a TV show. It's just in audio form as well, and you wonder whether this is actually anything new. They're just going to launch LBC as a TV station. Yeah,
and I suppose if you look at, say, Spotify and Amazon Music and Stitcher and Sony Music are all like investing serious money in either getting big creators on board, like the sort of, hundreds of millions they paid for Joe Rogan, or then we've got the Obamas and the Sussexes and Kim Kardashian.
What a list.
I know, yeah.
All in the same podcast.
Yeah, no, that would be a show. But they're all being bought up as properties, and it isn't just, you're right, it isn't just because there's a lot of money in podcasting in particular, but if you have, in Spotify's case, Joe Rogan on your books exclusively, then people will buy into Spotify generally as the place that they also get their music because they like to get Joe Rogan as well. And I think that exclusivity is part of what's driving at least some of this move, though there are other financial motivations as well.
And there's an interesting contradiction happening at the same time, Holden, it seems to me, which is these corporations are embracing podcasting supposedly because it's free or freer. You know, here are these uninhibited conversations. They are freewheeling, they're long form, they're swearing, people are intimate and informal. But at the same time, as these big corporations like Global and Spotify get involved in making podcasts, not just distributing them, those shows almost necessarily are going to start sounding less free, aren't they? And they're going to be less freely available as well. They're going to be paywalled within their particular app.
One of the reasons that podcasts did have that freedom is that the barrier to entry was really low, whether you're talking about individuals setting up podcasts of their own or companies doing the sort of thing that we did, which was to, come up with a format and just start recording. We would not have been able to set up our own TV station. If we had wanted to get something on the radio, there would have been many more meetings. There would have been a bigger budget. There would have, we'd have had to get far more approval for how we were going to go about things. Now that multi-million-dollar deals are being done to put these sorts of shows together, there's going to be a lot more people with interest in making sure they're successful, and that's going to mean more risk aversion, and perhaps that will start to erode some of the charm that has been the making of podcasts. It's also going to mean that there's a lot more marketing budget put into these shows that do have big financial backers, which is going to mean that it will be much harder for the smaller DIY type podcasts to make it to the top of lists, to get into people's playlists in the first place, because that is one of the big challenges that still remains with podcasts, is how do you discover fresh shows that you might not know about, whereas on traditional radio you might just have had something on in the background and gradually find yourself paying more attention to it.
Okay, Arion, you're up next after this. Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for? Not just now, but in the future with sentimental reflection and joy.
So this week we learned that for headaches, the best cure is 2 old favourite songs and a picture of your childhood home.
The temperature of our favourite time of the year. The sight of the landscape of the environment we grew up in. The taste of a home-cooked meal. The emotion of an old song that we once listened to on repeat for a month straight. All of these things elicit a feeling so unique and powerful that it appears to transcend time and space. It brings us into a state of being that cannot be described with anything other than just this one word. It is nostalgia. Nostalgia is one of the most unique and valuable capacities of the human mind. It is the closest thing we have to time travel.
What is nostalgia and why is it so important? A video from YouTube channel Pursuit of Wonder from 2017. Arion, what is the story this week?
So the story this week is that scientists have found that nostalgia can alleviate pain. And according to a study by researchers at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, there's a direct relationship between happy memories, such as those when you think of an old childhood holiday or a packet of sweets that you used to love, and the part of the brain that registers pain. So scientists at the university did tests on 34 young people and showed them images associated with childhood, and then used an MRI machine to assess their brain activity while a source of pain was applied, which in this case was a 3-second heat pulse to the forearm. The results showed that when a subject was experiencing nostalgia, they felt less pain.
Okay. That doesn't sound that dramatic a study. I mean, that sounds like sort of hypnosis, NLP type stuff. We know, don't we, that if we look at things that bring us pleasure, it's going to decrease the pain that we feel. So the specific thing that's new is that nostalgia can be one of those things that gives us pleasure, just like looking at our favourite food or our favourite people.
Yes, exactly. And you're right that there are broad attempts to try to address the issues associated with drug-based painkillers, which are obviously potentially addictive in many cases. So researchers around the world are often searching for these non-pharmacological analgesics. And I think what's new about this is that we didn't know that specifically nostalgia could act as one of these psychological tactics to approach that exact question.
And also generic nostalgia as well, Kate. That's what was interesting to me about this study. It wasn't that they showed people pictures from their own childhood or their school. it was a generic school classroom roughly from the era when they went to primary school, or a generic brand or cartoon that they might have seen when they were a child. And that still had the same effect.
Yeah, I think it was also a generic bike from around the time when they were young as well. But I guess you've got to remember that most classrooms look the same, most bikes look the same. So even though it wasn't necessarily their bike, the impact felt as powerful to them as though it was.
And the word nostalgia, what does it actually mean?
So interestingly, the word nostalgia comes from the Greek nostos, which means return home, and algos, which means pain. And I think that is fascinating because, yeah, nostalgia can actually be really painful, and you can look back and remember your childhood and remember situations long gone and actually feel this kind of sense of mourning and loss. And I think people also look back at their past with rose-tinted glasses and perhaps romanticize it a bit as well, which can be quite unhelpful. For example, I feel like almost every generation seems to look back and say, oh, things were better in my day, but forgetting all the progress that's been made. It's something that even I'm now beginning to do. I look back at my childhood and think, oh, things were great back then. But I think rather than thinking about the negatives, I'm remembering stuff like not having loads of responsibilities, being free, not having to make decisions, not having any regrets, because when you're a child, you haven't made decisions yet, so you don't really have things that you can regret. So I think it's all a combination of that. But yeah, it certainly is a bittersweet emotion.
And I think that's one of the theories as to why it is effective at sort of distracting from pain or moderating pain, is that it is such a complex emotion, and it does have these elements of a sense of loss, but also a sense of contentment and a sort of serenity, but also comes tinged with a feeling almost of mortality. According to the reports I read, it's not just a distraction, it's actually subduing or almost sedating two of the parts of the brain that are reacting to the chemicals that create the sensation of pain, and also then sort of quietening down the thalamus, which relays information from the rest of the body back to the brain and tells it what's going on elsewhere.
Okay, but what are we supposed to do with this information, Arion? I mean, if we're constantly practicing thinking about nostalgia as a way of minimizing pain, I don't know, most mindfulness practices encourage people to be present, not to dwell on the past.
Yes, and perhaps this is something else to add into our arsenal of non-pharmacological pain therapies. And, a recent Harvard review found lots of non-drug-based therapies that work to relieve pain, including the familiar kind of just applying cold and heat, or physical therapy and occupational therapy, or things like yoga and Tai Chi, or, as you say, the sort of mindfulness of sort of putting people into the present moment. But I think that this could be added to that. And in fact, according to the American Psychological Association, there is a new form of therapy called reminiscence therapy that's being used particularly with Alzheimer's and patients who have other cognitive and neurodegenerative diseases. And they use this sort of reminiscence therapy, showing them actually things from their own life, the sort of written or oral or even pictographic histories of their own sort of history, to stimulate them through what is otherwise a really difficult experience. And I suppose this then adds an extra layer to that, exactly as you were saying, that maybe it doesn't even need to be specific to the patient. It can be as general as, here is a really fun cartoon that everyone was watching when you were a kid. How does that make you feel? And the answer is usually good.
Yeah, but Holden, if you were laid up in hospital right now and a doctor recommended nostalgia as a treatment, how would you feel about that?
Well, it should be noted that this was only effective for mild pain, and that more acute pain tends to overwhelm the sedative effect that it has. But I think we've talked quite a few times about alternative medicines and different ways of approaching either physical or mental health issues. And I think the one of the barriers they always come up with is the feeling that you're being fobbed off unless you're getting a drug or something that feels like it is a medical intervention rather than a more social intervention. But I think, the more we learn about all of these different approaches, the more it seems that either on their own or in tandem with more conventional approaches, you really can change the way your brain, your body, your mind thinks of itself, thinks of the challenges it's facing, and that can have quite a powerful effect on your experience of illness or pain.
And I guess, Kate, because of the internet and the constant availability of basically all pop culture, it's now possible, isn't it, to dip into the stuff that used to make us feel comfort when we were younger. There was this trend during the early months of COVID where people retreated to the video games from their childhood.
Yeah, I know that Sims did really well at the early stages of the pandemic. And millennials and Gen Zs have been named the most nostalgic generation, and I'm sure that part of that is to do with how easy it is for those age groups to access nostalgic content. I mean, on Netflix, shows like Friends and Gilmore Girls are among the most streamed, and that definitely has got a nostalgic element to it. But on social media as well, there's hugely popular trends like on Thursdays, the hashtag Throwback Thursday, where people share photos of themselves when they were younger and great moments that they experienced in the past. I feel like there's this huge kind of cult phenomenon around nostalgia.
Except, of course, as we discover on a daily basis on the Retrospectors, Arion, when you actually look back at stuff from the past that people feel warmly about, you look at it and it's very problematic. Things weren't better then, were they? They were different.
Yeah, that's right. And psychologists today recognize that there's kind of good and bad forms of nostalgia, and they try to separate it out into, first of all, the beneficial type called personal nostalgia, which is that kind when an individual reminisces about, aspects of their own past life, including, happy milestones such as graduations and weddings and so on. And they want to contrast this with historical nostalgia, which is tied to sort of valuing periods of time that often occurred either when you were young yourself or even before your birth. And that, many psychologists think, is a comparative negative form of nostalgia because it makes us think that there were times that were good previously that we should aim to return to, often being critical of the political moment in which we're living right now. So I think that breaking it down into those two different categories of nostalgia is kind of helpful.
Holden, what are your nostalgic comforts? I imagine you rereading all of Douglas Adams.
I may have done that. I have definitely also been retreating into the Beatles' back catalogue more during the COVID pandemic than I might otherwise have done, and been enjoying Peter Jackson's film, which is perhaps a mixture of both of those types of nostalgia, because I do remember, it takes me back to my childhood when I was first hearing those songs, but also takes me back to 20 years before I was born, and a very different world. I'm also actually at the moment just rewatching Mad Men, which I think is a really interesting example of the power of nostalgia, because although the writers there are very acutely aware, I think, of the very negative qualities of the 60s, the race, the gender, even the smoking and drinking, and they do a great deal to highlight that. But even so, it's so easy to be
so sexy, isn't it?
By
and cool.
the styles, the clothes, the cars, the that feeling of simpler times, which it's very clearly not, because you have the dramatization of all of the assassinations of the 60s, all of the racial prejudice and angst. I was also thinking about the Marx line about religion being the opiate of the people, and wondering whether actually it's now nostalgia more than religion that performs that role, literally in the case of this study, but also metaphorically in the way Marx meant it, in that sort of shared, collective and rose-tinted idea of how things used to be probably does contribute to both a small c and a large c conservative approach to politics and history.
Well, it is only a matter of time before this episode becomes a nostalgic favourite, so let's plan our cast reunion for this time next year. In the meantime, my thanks to Holden and Kate and Arion for their stories. We will be back next week. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're looking for something else to listen to right now, then why not try The Overview, the new podcast from the Week's digital team. It is a guide to the past, present and future of news, bringing you the stories you'll wish you already knew about. Our regular panellists Julia and Joe are on the current episode asking, are international NGOs helpful or harmful? Follow that show now, The Overview from the Week, wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.